Welcome, noble friends and seekers of history. Today I invite you on a journey into the heart of the Middle Ages, an era of knights, faith, sacrifice, and conquest. Together, we will step into the life of one man whose name echoes through the centuries, Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler of Jerusalem after the First Crusade. This is not just the story of a warrior, but of a man caught between the sword and the cross, torn between earthly ambition and divine purpose. You are about to witness the transformation of a noble knight into a legend, remembered by some as a saintly defender of Christendom, and by others as a symbol of ambition cloaked in faith. Through these chapters, we will uncover battles fought, choices made, alliances forged, and betrayals endured. You will walk with Godfrey as he marches across Europe, storms the walls of Jerusalem, and carves his place into history. Prepare yourself, this is not just history, it is drama, sacrifice, and destiny. By the end, you will not only know who Godfrey of Bouillon was, but also why his legacy still matters today. Imagine a world aflame with holy zeal. Thousands of men, women, and children march across continents, driven by faith, hunger, and fear. In their midst rides one man, a knight of noble blood, his sword sharp, his soul heavy. He will not wear a crown of gold, but instead a crown of thorns. This man is Godfrey of Bouillon, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is his story. Subscribe for more history, like, and comment. If you believe history should never be forgotten, and share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth, this is history. And it begins here. The 11th century was an age of both faith and fire. Europe was a land divided by countless lords and kingdoms, yet bound together by one power, the Church of Rome. The peasants toiled in the fields, bound to the soil, while armored knights thundered across muddy roads, swearing loyalty to their lords, but bowing ultimately to God. Across the continent, the name of Christ was on every tongue, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest king. Yet behind the prayers lay fear. Fear of sin, of damnation, and of the advancing power of Islam. For centuries, Muslim armies had spread across the Holy Land, and the sacred city of Jerusalem lay under their rule. To the Christian mind, this was an unbearable wound. It was also a time of constant warfare. Castles rose upon hills, not as symbols of peace, but as fortresses of survival. Feudal lords clashed endlessly, spilling Christian blood in petty rivalries. But beyond these local wars, a greater storm was gathering. A storm that would shake the world. In the year Itzenling Josewu, Pope Urban II called upon Christendom to rise. From the town of Clermont, his fiery words rang out, "God wills it!" He urged knights and peasants alike to take up the cross and march to Jerusalem. It was not only a war, it was salvation itself. For those who fought, forgiveness of sins was promised. For those who died, eternal glory in heaven. Europe trembled at these words. For the first time, thousands of men and women saw beyond their own fields and castles. A vision of Jerusalem burned in their hearts. Across the Rhine, across the Danube, across the very mountains, streams of pilgrims and warriors would soon march eastward. Among them was a man whose name history would not forget. Godfrey of Bouillon. Born of noble blood, raised in the traditions of chivalry, he would soon leave his ancestral lands to join the Holy March. But before his story begins, we must understand the world he was born into, a world of iron, faith, and unending war. This was the age of faith and war, and from it legends were forged. Tankos, Godfrey of Bouillon was born around the year Itzenlingles, in the heart of medieval Europe, at Boulogne-sur-Mer, in present-day France. His birth was not ordinary. It was destined. He was born into the powerful house of Boulogne, a family whose bloodline stretched deep into the nobility of France and Germany. His father, Eustace II, Count of Boulogne, was a renowned crusader of his own time, while his mother, Ida of Lorraine, was said to be a woman of deep faith and unwavering piety. From birth, Godfrey was surrounded by the clamor of knights, the prayers of monks, and the intrigues of noble courts. The castle walls echoed with both the clash of steel and the chanting of priests. He was taught that his lineage carried both honor and responsibility. The Boulogne family claimed descent from Charlemagne himself, the great emperor of the Franks, and this ancient heritage became a guiding light for young Godfrey. Even as a child, he displayed a seriousness uncommon for his age. Where other boys quarreled and played, Godfrey was drawn to the chapel, kneeling in silence before the altar. Yet he was no frail scholar. From the age of 7, he was trained in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the hunt. His tutors drilled into him the code of chivalry, courage, loyalty, and above all, service to God. His childhood was not without shadow. His father's death left him under the care of his mother, who raised him with devotion. She instilled in him the belief that his noble blood was not for idle luxury, but for holy service. In Godfrey's lineage lay both the sword of kings and the humility of saints. He was born not just to inherit lands, but to carry a destiny that would echo far beyond the walls of his ancestral home. The shadow of Charlemagne loomed large over medieval Europe, and for Godfrey of Bouillon, it was more than history, it was heritage. Chroniclers of his time claimed that his blood carried the legacy of the great Frankish emperor, whose empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. To be linked to Charlemagne was not simply an honor, it was a burden of destiny. Godfrey grew up listening to stories of that golden age. Around the fire in Bouillon Castle, bards sang of Charlemagne's conquest and his defense of Christendom. Priests recounted how the emperor had been crowned by the Pope himself, symbol of the union between faith and sword. For a boy like Godfrey, these tales were not idle stories. They were a map of what he should become. True. The political landscape around him reflected the decline of that empire. Europe was fractured, kingdoms splintered, lords competing for scraps of power. Yet, in every crumbling stone of the empire, Godfrey saw the chance for renewal. Where others saw the past, he saw the future. His early influences were not only historical, but personal. His uncle, Godfrey the Hunchback, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was one of the most powerful lords of the region. Though often harsh, the Duke embodied the strength of leadership and the burden of command. Godfrey of Bouillon spent his formative years under his uncle's watchful eye, absorbing lessons, not only of battle but of statecraft. As the years passed, the young knight came to embody the very spirit of the Carolingian legacy, faith, war, and justice. Those who saw him remarked on his dignity. Even as a youth, he carried himself not as a mere noble, but as one destined for something greater. Bouillon Castle rose from the cliffs of the Ardennes, a fortress of stone and shadow. Here, Godfrey of Bouillon spent his formative years, learning not only the art of war, but the rhythm of medieval life. The castle was a world unto itself, a small kingdom of lords, soldiers, servants, and priests. The daily life of the castle shaped him. At dawn, the clang of hammers rang from the blacksmith's forge. Knights trained in the courtyard, the crash of shields echoing against the stone walls. In the kitchens, the aroma of bread and roasted meat mingled with the smoke of hearth fires. Each sound, each scent, was a reminder of the order and discipline of noble life. For Godfrey, however, Bouillon was not only a home but a school. He hunted in the surrounding forests, learning to track deer and boar core. He trained his body for endurance, riding for hours wielding heavy swords until his arms ached. Yet he also trained his spirit. The castle's chapel became his sanctuary, where he listened to monks read scripture, his young mind absorbing the lessons of humility and divine justice. Soon, his mother often guided him in these moments, reminding him that a true knight must fight not for pride, but for God. The duality of Bouillon, its harsh discipline of war and its sacred devotion, etched itself into his soul. By the time he reached manhood, those around him could already see the shaping of a leader. His composure, his discipline, his devotion, these qualities marked him as a knight who would one day be more than just another lord in the endless feuds of Europe. Bouillon Castle had not only protected him, it had forged him. The day came when Godfrey was no longer a boy of Bouillon, but a knight in his own right. His knighthood ceremony was more than a rite of passage. It was a sacred bond, a transformation of soul, as much as of body. On the eve of his dubbing, he kept vigil in the castle chapel. Alone, clad in a simple white tunic, he prayed through the night. The flicker of candles danced upon his face. As he whispered words of devotion, he asked for strength, for courage, and for purity of heart. This night was not one of sleep, but of spiritual awakening. At dawn, he bathed, symbolizing purification. His weapons, sword, shield, and spurs, were placed upon the altar, blessed by the priest. Then, before the gathered lords and knights, he knelt before his liege lord. The flat of the sword tapped his shoulders as words were spoken. In the name of God, Saint Michael, and Saint George, I dub thee knight. Be brave, be loyal, be just. When he rose, he was no longer simply Godfrey of Bouillon. He was Sir Godfrey, sworn to defend the weak, uphold justice, and serve God with his life. His chainmail weighed upon his shoulders, not as burden, but as mantle of honor. His sword gleamed, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a cross-shaped symbol of his new life. Those who witnessed it spoke of his solemnity. Unlike some who laughed or boasted after their dubbing, Godfrey remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the altar. Already his heart belonged not to earthly ambition, but to a higher calling. Thus began the journey of a knight who would soon march beyond the forests of his homeland toward destiny in the Holy Land. In November Ichenling Josewu, the world of Christendom changed forever. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a sea of lords, knights, and peasants, his voice carrying a fire that would ignite all Europe. The Holy Land, he declared, lay under the rule of infidels. Jerusalem, the city of Christ's passion and resurrection, was defiled. He called upon Christians to march east, not for conquest, but for salvation. Urban's words struck the crowd like thunder. God wills it! The promise was extraordinary. Those who took the cross would be absolved of all sins. The eternal gates of heaven would open for them. For many, it was the chance to exchange endless wars between Christian lords for a single holy mission under God's banner. News of Clermont spread like wildfire across Europe. Men and women alike sewed crosses of red cloth upon their tunics. Noble lords pledged armies. Peasants, hungry and weary of toil, saw in this journey both hope and redemption. Far from Clermont, in his castle, Godfrey of Bouillon listened as messengers brought word of this call. A knight bound by faith and blood, he felt the weight of destiny pressing upon him. To march east was not merely duty. It was providence. The call of the Pope was the call of God himself, and Godfrey would answer. When the words of Clermont reached Godfrey, he knew his destiny had arrived. No longer was he simply a knight of Bouillon. He was to become a pilgrim warrior of Christ. Before the altar of his chapel, he knelt, the red cross stitched upon his cloak. It was a simple piece of cloth, but it bore the weight of eternity. Taking the cross was not only a vow, It was a sacrifice to finance his journey. Godfrey sold or mortgaged his lands. His ancestral holdings, the pride of his family, were offered up so that he might lead men to Jerusalem. In that moment, he showed that faith stood higher than earthly wealth. Those around him spoke of his resolve, while many nobles sought glory or riches. Godfrey's motives seemed purer. He vowed not to wear a crown of gold, but to defend the sepulchre of Christ. As word spread, knights and peasants flocked to his banner. They saw in Godfrey a leader of justice, courage, and humility. His halls filled with men who would march with him into the unknown. The cross upon his chest marked the beginning of a new life. Godfrey of Bouillon had become a crusader. The call to crusade did not only summon knights. It stirred the very soul of Europe. In towns and villages, peasants abandoned their plows, artisans left their workshops, and women gathered children to join the march. Entire families set out on pilgrimage, convinced that Jerusalem awaited them. But it was the knights who formed the core of Godfrey's army. Men of noble blood answered his banner, bringing with them retainers and squires. Steel clashed in practice yards as preparations for war filled the air. Horses were shod, swords sharpened, banners stitched with crosses. Godfrey, as commander, did not stand apart from his men. He trained with them, prayed with them, and shared in their hardships. His leadership was not forged in arrogance, but in humility. Those who followed him said he bore the spirit of a saintly knight, resolute yet compassionate. But not all who joined were disciplined. Vast crowds of peasants, ill-armed and hungry, followed behind the knights. Some carried pitchforks instead of swords, some barefoot, driven by desperation more than strategy. They would become both the heart and the burden of the crusade. The army swelled. A tide of humanity bound eastward. It was not yet united, but under Godfrey's guidance, it would march as one toward destiny. The spring of Ichenling Joshalup saw. The crusading hosts begin their march. Under Godfrey of Bouillon, the armies crossed the Rhine, leaving behind the familiar lands of France and the Low Countries. The journey to Jerusalem had begun. The march east was both majestic and chaotic. Thousands of armored knights rode in shining columns, banners fluttering in the wind. Behind them, endless lines of peasants trudged, carts creaking under supplies. Songs of pilgrims mixed with the clang of armor. To many, it seemed less like an army and more like a moving nation. Crossing the Rhine marked more than a physical journey. It was a spiritual threshold. Europe was behind them, and the unknown lay ahead. Every bridge crossed, every town passed, carried them farther from home and closer to destiny. Yet the march was fraught with hardship. Supplies ran short, tempers flared, and discipline often broke down. Still, Godfrey's steady hand guided them. He rode among his men, calming disputes, sharing food with the hungry, and reminding them that they marched not for themselves, but for God. The sight of this immense host sent ripples of awe and fear across Europe. The crusade was no longer a dream. It was a reality, thundering eastward. As the army pressed eastward, hardships mounted, supplies dwindled, and hunger gnawed at both knight and peasant. Bread grew scarce, meat was rationed, and many survived only on roots and wild berries. Disease spread among the camp, claiming lives before swords could. Yet hunger was met with faith. Each trial was seen as a test from God. Priests urged the weary pilgrims to endure, promising that every hardship would be rewarded with eternal glory. The people clung to prayers as tightly as they clung to their weapons. Godfrey himself set the example. Unlike many nobles who feasted while peasants starved, he shared in the suffering. Chroniclers recorded that he refused fine meals, choosing instead to eat what his men ate. This act bound him closer to his followers, for they saw in him not only a lord, but a shepherd. The march was not without danger. Bandits struck at stragglers, while foreign lords grew uneasy at the passage of this immense horde. Yet the army endured, held together by the vision of Jerusalem. Each night, under the stars, the weary pilgrims sang hymns, their voices rising like incense to heaven. Hunger weakened their bodies, but faith kept their spirit unbroken. The Crusader host pressed deeper into Europe, their sheer size striking fear into the lands they passed. When Godfrey's army approached the borders of Hungary, tension ran high. The Hungarians remembered the chaos caused by earlier, undisciplined crusading mobs that pillaged their villages. They feared Godfrey's men would bring the same destruction. But Godfrey was different. He sent envoys ahead to negotiate safe passage with King Coloman of Hungary. Unlike other leaders who seized what they wanted by force, Godfrey relied on diplomacy. He promised that his knights would keep discipline and respect local laws. Still, hunger gnawed at the army. Any delay meant desperation. Temptation lingered among restless peasants who eyed Hungarian granaries. One spark could ignite violence. Godfrey's presence became the anchor. He rode among the ranks, warning that to dishonor their vows was to dishonor God. His strict discipline curbed looting, and his negotiations with Coloman gained grudging trust. Supplies were sold, markets opened, and the Crusaders passed through Hungary largely in peace. This was a moment that revealed Godfrey's strength, not just as a warrior, but as a leader who could wield restraint. He proved that faith and diplomacy could march side by side. Beyond Hungary lay the vast empire of Byzantium. Its heart, Constantinople, was the richest city in Christendom, shimmering with golden domes and towering walls. Yet, relations between Byzantines and Crusaders were strained. The empire had called for help, but it feared the Western Knights almost as much as the Turks. When Godfrey arrived, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos received him with grandeur but suspicion. Alexios demanded that all Crusader leaders swear an oath of fealty, promising to return any conquered lands to Byzantium. For proud Western lords, this was an insult. Some balked at the idea, whispering treachery. Godfrey, however, saw the necessity. Without Byzantine ships and supplies, the Crusaders could not cross into Asia. Though he disliked bending the knee, he knelt before Alexios, swearing the oath. Chroniclers say he did so not from weakness, but from wisdom. Still, tensions flared. Rumors spread that the Byzantines plotted against them. Skirmishes broke out between Crusader soldiers and locals. But through it all, Godfrey maintained order, restraining his men from reckless violence. This uneasy alliance would shape the crusade. Godfrey's diplomacy once again kept the mission alive. But trust between East and West was as fragile as glass. The oath to Emperor Alexios did not end the suspicion between Crusaders and Byzantines. To many knights, the Byzantines seemed treacherous, preferring subtle schemes to open battle. To the Byzantines, the Crusaders were unruly barbarians, dangerous as allies and disastrous as enemies. Godfrey found himself balancing on a blade's edge. On one side were his fellow lords, angry at being treated like vassals. On the other, the emperor, wary of betrayal. Any misstep could collapse the crusade before it even began. In Constantinople, rumors flew of plots and betrayals. Some Crusaders attempted to desert. Others clashed with Byzantine soldiers in the streets. Yet Godfrey restrained his forces, preventing bloodshed from boiling over. Chroniclers note that he walked carefully, stern with his men, respectful to Alexios. His wisdom bore fruit. Byzantine ships ferried the Crusaders across the Bosporus, into the land of the Turks. Suspicion lingered like a storm cloud. But the journey continued. Through this uneasy truce, Godfrey showed again his role as mediator, keeping the fragile alliance intact. He was more than a warrior. He was becoming the steady hand that held the crusade together. The first true test of the Crusaders came at Nicaea, a fortified city held by the Seljuk Turks. Its high stone walls bristled with defenders, its towers crowned with archers. For the Crusaders, it was the gateway into Asia Minor. Godfrey and the other leaders surrounded the city, building siege engines from timber. Towers rose, battering rams rolled forward. For weeks, arrows darkened the sky as Crusaders hurled stones and Turks rained down fire. The siege was brutal. Men fell to arrows, ladders burned under boiling oil. Hunger gnawed as supplies dwindled. Yet Godfrey remained at the front, directing his men with calm resolve. Chroniclers tell of his bravery. He fought where the fighting was fiercest, but also ensured wounded men were tended to. Unexpectedly, it was Byzantine diplomacy that won the city. Secretly negotiating with the Turks, Alexios arranged their surrender to him, not the Crusaders. When the city gates opened, Byzantine banners flew, not Crusader ones. Some knights seethed with anger, feeling cheated of victory. Godfrey, however, kept peace. Though disappointed, he accepted the emperor's claim, understanding that the greater war lay ahead. Nicaea was taken, and the crusade moved forward. No sooner had Nicaea fallen than the Crusaders marched into the heart of Anatolia. At Dorylaeum, the Seljuk Turks struck back with ferocity. Swarms of mounted archers surrounded the Crusader vanguard, loosing endless arrows. Panic rippled through the ranks as knights fell, pierced by shafts. The Turks fought with speed and precision, circling like hawks. Dust rose as horses thundered. The Crusaders, heavy in armor, struggled to counter the swift cavalry. For a moment, it seemed disaster loomed. Godfrey stood firm. Riding among his men, he shouted encouragement, rallying them to form tight defensive lines. Shields locked, spears braced, they resisted wave after wave. His courage inspired his soldiers, who clung to faith and discipline. Hours passed in bloody stalemate, until reinforcements arrived. Bohemond and Raymond of Toulouse crashing into the Turkish flank. The tide turned. Now the Turks fled, their arrows spent, their courage broken. The field was littered with the dead, but the Crusaders stood victorious. Chroniclers praised Godfrey's calm in chaos, his refusal to break, his valor under fire. At Dorylaeum, he proved not only his bravery, but his leadership in the crucible of battle. After the victory at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders pressed deeper into the burning plains of Anatolia. Yet triumph quickly gave way to torment. The land was barren, villages abandoned, fields scorched, rivers dry. The Seljuk Turks employed scorched earth tactics, leaving nothing for the vast Crusader host. Hunger and thirst became relentless enemies. Men collapsed from heat. Horses died in droves, their carcasses left rotting on the roadside. Bread turned to dust, and soldiers gnawed on leather straps to quiet their hunger. Still, Godfrey marched at the head. Chroniclers recall him refusing special rations, eating what his men ate, drinking muddy water beside them. His endurance became an anchor for weary hearts at night. Priests lifted wooden crosses and led hymns beneath the stars. Exhausted peasants clung to faith, whispering that their suffering was a reflection of Christ's passion. Some faltered, some died, yet the column pushed forward. When at last the mountains rose before them, green valleys offered a taste of relief. But the crusade had been forged in suffering. Hunger, thirst, and death had tested their resolve, and they had endured. The Crusaders' weary march ended at the walls of Antioch, one of the greatest fortified cities of the East. Its towers loomed high, walls stretching for miles, bristling with defenders. To take Antioch was essential, for without it, the road to Jerusalem was closed. Godfrey and the other leaders encircled the city, but their numbers were thin compared to the walls they faced. Months dragged on, famine striking harder than arrows. Soldiers boiled leather, ate grass, and in desperation, some turned to cannibalism in the darkest hours. Godfrey's role was crucial. Chroniclers describe him as steady, even when hope seemed lost. He inspired his men with his calm presence, urging them to endure. He also fought fiercely in skirmishes, leading sorties against Turkish relief forces. The siege tested not only bodies but souls. Many doubted, whispering that God had abandoned them. Yet Godfrey never wavered, his faith as strong as his sword. When the city finally fell, it was through both cunning and desperation, a combination of betrayal within Antioch and the Crusaders' relentless will. Antioch became both triumph and tragedy, won at unimaginable cost, yet proving the Crusaders' resolve to reach Jerusalem. When Antioch finally fell, the Crusaders rejoiced, but victory was poisoned with betrayal. Bohemond of Taranto, one of the Crusade leaders, claimed the city for himself. He argued that by right of conquest, Antioch belonged to him, not to Byzantium and not to the collective crusade. This decision split the army. Some leaders accused Bohemond of greed, others supported him. Tensions rose as rivalries threatened to undo everything. Godfrey, however, kept himself apart from the quarrels. Chroniclers describe him as the most unselfish of the lords, refusing to seize Antioch for personal gain. His focus was always Jerusalem. Meanwhile, outside the walls, a massive Muslim relief army approached. Antioch, newly captured, was besieged again, this time with the Crusaders trapped inside. Hunger and despair returned with vengeance. Many knights lost faith. Some deserted, fleeing under cover of night. But Godfrey's steadiness remained a beacon. He urged the lords to unite, warning that division would doom them all. His words, though often ignored, still inspired many soldiers. In the chaos of politics and betrayal, Godfrey became the quiet conscience of the crusade. In the darkest days of Antioch's second siege, despair nearly broke the Crusaders. Surrounded, starving, and divided, many believed all was lost. But then came a miracle, or so it was claimed. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew declared he had a vision, the Holy Lance. The spear that pierced Christ's side lay buried beneath the city's cathedral. Desperate for hope, the leaders allowed the search. When the relic was unearthed, cries of joy filled the city. Whether divine or deception, it mattered little. The Crusaders' spirits blazed anew. Soldiers, who had been weak with hunger, now shouted with zeal. Godfrey stood among them, holding the relic aloft, as priests proclaimed God's favor returned. His faith never wavered. But now the entire army felt restored. Soon after, the Crusaders stormed out of Antioch in one last desperate charge. Against all odds, they broke the Muslim siege. The Holy Lance became a symbol of divine blessing, proof that their cause was just. For Godfrey, it was a reminder that faith could triumph, even when swords and shields failed. After Antioch, the road to Jerusalem stretched long, but clear. The Crusaders, though battered and diminished, set their eyes on the holy city. Every step was a prayer. Every hardship endured a sacrifice for the goal they had dreamed of since Clermont. The journey south was grueling. Disease struck again, and many fell by the wayside. Yet the thought of Jerusalem sustained them. The city was no longer just a place. It was heaven itself, a promise of redemption. Godfrey led his men with unwavering resolve. Chroniclers describe him walking beside the poorest pilgrims, comforting them with words of encouragement. Where others rode proudly ahead, Godfrey remained among his soldiers, embodying humility. As they neared the Holy Land, the desert heat tested them once more. But then, one morning, cries rang through the camp. On the horizon, gleaming under the sun, the walls of Jerusalem appeared. Pilgrims dropped to their knees, weeping, crossing themselves, kissing the ground. For Godfrey, it was the culmination of destiny. Yet he knew the hardest trial lay ahead, the siege of the city itself. Jerusalem stood before them, holy and untouchable. To claim it would require blood, faith, and fire. The summer sun of Ichenling Josejot blazed mercilessly as the Crusaders stood before the walls of Jerusalem. After 3 years of hardship, the holy city finally lay before them. But its massive stone walls towered over the exhausted host. Inside, defenders prepared for war, pouring boiling oil, stockpiling arrows, and sealing gates tight. The Crusaders were weak from hunger and thirst. The desert offered little water, and supplies were scarce. Yet their spirits burned with hope. Priests urged them on, declaring that to die before Jerusalem was to enter heaven. Godfrey himself walked barefoot around the city, imitating the biblical Joshua circling Jericho, praying for divine intervention. Wood for siege engines was scarce, forcing the Crusaders to scour the hills for branches. Slowly, towers and rams were built. The defenders mocked them from the walls, hurling insults and arrows. But the Crusaders pressed on, driven not by pride but by faith. As the siege dragged, the army grew restless. But Godfrey kept discipline, urging his men to endure. He reminded them that Jerusalem was not just a city, it was salvation. And so the siege began, not merely with weapons, but with prayers. On July 15, 1999, the final assault began. Siege towers rolled toward Jerusalem, creaking under the weight of men and weapons. Arrows filled the air, defenders hurling stones and fire. Yet Godfrey's tower pressed forward relentlessly. Chroniclers tell of Godfrey himself at the front, crossbow in hand, striking down defenders from the tower's height. His courage was unmatched. While others hesitated, he pressed on. At last, his tower reached the wall. With sword drawn, Godfrey leapt onto the battlements. The clash was brutal. Steel rang against steel, blood splattered stone. Crusaders surged up ladders, pouring over the walls. Godfrey cut a path, his banner lifted high. For the first time, the Crusaders stood atop Jerusalem's defenses. The gates were soon thrown open, and the city lay vulnerable. Godfrey's leadership had broken the wall. The dream of generations was now within reach. Yet this triumph carried a shadow. The blood of battle stained the holy city before it was ever sanctified. But in that moment, Godfrey became immortal in the eyes of his men. The knight who led them into Jerusalem itself. Once the walls were breached, chaos erupted within Jerusalem. Crusaders poured into the streets, their battle cries mingling with screams. Blood flowed through alleys as defenders were cut down. Chroniclers recorded both triumph and horror. The city had fallen, but at terrible cost. For many nights, this was the fulfillment of divine promise. They rushed to the holy sepulchre, falling to their knees in tears, kissing the stone. For others, vengeance and fury consumed them, and slaughter swept the city. Godfrey, however, sought the holy places. He laid down his sword upon the altar of the sepulchre, kneeling in prayer. Unlike many who gloried in conquest, his heart was solemn. He saw Jerusalem not as a prize of war, but as a sacred trust. The contrast was stark. Some Crusaders drenched in blood, others drenched in tears. The city was theirs, yet the cost haunted its stones. Jerusalem was both redeemed and desecrated in the same breath. But for Christendom, it was victory beyond imagination. The holy city, after centuries under Muslim rule, was now in Christian hands. The First Crusade had achieved its impossible goal. The fall of Jerusalem left the city both holy and haunted. For days, the stench of blood lingered. Streets that pilgrims once dreamed of walking were filled with corpses. Chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, wrote of the massacre in tones of awe and horror. Godfrey's heart was heavy. Though a soldier, he had never gloried in slaughter. He ordered protection for certain holy sites, ensuring no desecration befell them. He moved among his men, urging restraint, but the frenzy of conquest was beyond his full control. In the days that followed, cleansing began. Churches were purified, relics restored, hymns sung in the holy places. Pilgrims walked barefoot to the Sepulchre, tears streaming down their faces. For them, Jerusalem was redeemed, yet for Godfrey the victory was bittersweet. The cross had triumphed, but at a terrible moral cost. He prayed long in silence, asking forgiveness for the sins committed in the shadow of the holy walls. Jerusalem was Christian again, but its stones wept with both blood and tears. And in this paradox lay the destiny of Godfrey, guardian of a city both sanctified and scarred. When Jerusalem was secured, the Crusader lords gathered. A ruler was needed for the holy city. Many turned to Godfrey, whose leadership had carried them through trials. They offered him a crown, urging him to become king of Jerusalem, but Godfrey refused. His words would echo through centuries. "I will not wear a crown of gold, where my Savior wore a crown of thorns." To him, ruling Jerusalem was not about power or glory. It was about guardianship. He accepted instead the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His humility astonished his peers. Where others might have seized kingship, Godfrey chose servitude. He ruled not as a monarch, but as a protector. His palace was the city's chapel, his throne the stone of Christ's tomb. The people of Jerusalem saw in him not just a lord, but a shepherd. Chroniclers praised his justice, his fairness, and his devotion. Godfrey's refusal of the crown transformed him from a mere crusader into a legend. He became the embodiment of the ideal knight, humble in victory, faithful in leadership, and forever remembered as the defender, not the king, of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was won, but conquest was only the beginning. The holy city, battered by war, needed order and governance. As defender of the Holy Sepulchre, Godfrey carried the immense responsibility of turning victory into stability. Unlike kings who ruled with pomp and tyranny, Godfrey ruled with humility. He organized councils of nobles, priests, and knights to share governance. Taxes were regulated, markets reopened, and surviving inhabitants were given protection under law. He sought not only to rule, but to restore. The city's holy sites were purified and placed under the care of priests and monks. Pilgrims who began to arrive found safety under Godfrey's administration. His laws emphasized justice, ensuring disputes were settled fairly, not through arbitrary violence. Chroniclers praised his refusal to enrich himself at the city's expense. Still, ruling Jerusalem was no easy task. Food remained scarce, and tensions simmered between crusaders eager for rewards and citizens fearful of oppression. Yet Godfrey's calm leadership kept the fragile city from descending into chaos. In just months, he turned Jerusalem from a blood-soaked battlefield into a functioning Christian capital. His rule set the foundation of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. A fragile but enduring legacy, Jerusalem's capture shocked the Muslim world. For centuries, the city had been under Islamic rule, and its loss was seen as a humiliation. Armies soon began to gather, determined to reclaim it. Godfrey knew that Jerusalem was fragile, its walls still scarred from siege, its defenders few. He sent messages to surrounding Crusader lords, urging unity. Yet some were reluctant, preferring to secure their own holdings. Godfrey's task was not just military, but diplomatic, keeping the Crusaders from fracturing while facing relentless external threats. The first major test came when Egyptian forces advanced from the south. Reports of their approach filled the city with fear. Godfrey ordered the walls repaired, towers strengthened, and soldiers drilled daily. He promised his people that the Sepulchre would never fall while he lived. Though vastly outnumbered, Godfrey's courage steadied the city. Chroniclers describe him riding along the battlements, encouraging knights and peasants alike. He spoke of faith and destiny, reminding them that God had given them Jerusalem, and only through faith could they hold it. The defenders prepared, aware that enemies surrounded them. Yet under Godfrey's watchful leadership, they felt unshakable, though united in conquest. The Crusaders were far from united in rule. Rivalries simmered between leaders: Bohemond of Antioch, Raymond of Toulouse, Tancred, and others, each seeking to expand their influence. Godfrey, as ruler of Jerusalem, had to balance these competing ambitions. Some lords accused him of weakness for refusing a crown. Others envied the prestige of Jerusalem itself. To keep peace, Godfrey summoned councils, listening with patience and ruling with fairness. He mediated disputes, reminding the Crusaders that their mission was spiritual, not personal. Meanwhile, Godfrey sought alliances with Christian Armenians and Eastern leaders, offering protection in return for support. His diplomacy extended beyond knights to commoners, ensuring stability among the city's mixed population. His ability to rise above selfish quarrels earned him respect. Because he was seen as the Crusade's conscience, a leader who placed faith above ambition. Yet beneath the unity he worked so hard to maintain, division was already planting seeds for future strife. Godfrey understood that Jerusalem's survival depended on more than prayer. Fortresses had to be built, walls strengthened, and routes secured. He began organizing the construction of outposts around the kingdom, ensuring pilgrims and merchants could travel in safety. Knates were dispatched to garrison key strongholds, while masons worked tirelessly to repair towers. Roads were patrolled and caravan routes reopened. Godfrey sought to make Jerusalem not just a holy city, but a functioning kingdom. But he never forgot the spiritual foundation of his rule. Monasteries and churches flourished under his protection. Priests were given authority over sacred sites, and pilgrims arrived in growing numbers. Godfrey himself often joined in worship, kneeling humbly beside peasants. The kingdom was fragile, its borders constantly threatened, but under Godfrey it began to take form. A blend of sword and faith, fortress and shrine. Chroniclers describe this period as one of renewal, a brief peace before storms to come. For Godfrey, it was the fulfillment of his vow not to rule as king, but to guard as defender. Though Jerusalem was secured, enemies continued to circle. In each end Ebite, word reached Godfrey that Egyptian forces were gathering in Ashkelon, threatening to strike at the holy city. Weak from years of hardships, Godfrey nonetheless prepared for battle. The campaign was swift and brutal. Godfrey marched south with his knights, determined to crush the threat before it reached Jerusalem. The Egyptian army was vast, its banners stretching across the horizon. But the Crusaders, though fewer, fought with unmatched zeal. On the battlefield, Godfrey rode at the center, sword flashing in the sun. Chroniclers describe him as fearless, rallying his men even as the enemy pressed hard. The clash of steel and cries of war echoed across the desert plain. Victory was achieved. The Egyptians were driven back, their threat broken. But for Godfrey, the triumph came at a cost. He was wounded, some say struck by a poisoned arrow, others that illness took root in his weakened body. Though victorious, a shadow now hung over him. The defender of Jerusalem had won his last battle, but fate was closing in. After Ashkelon, Godfrey returned to Jerusalem weakened. The wound or sickness he carried worsened with each passing day. His strength, once the anchor of the Crusaders, now faded. Yet he continued to govern, refusing to surrender his duty. Chroniclers describe him as pale, walking with difficulty, but still attending councils and hearing disputes. His humility never faltered. He prayed daily at the Sepulchre, asking not for life, but for Jerusalem's safety. As illness tightened its grip, his followers gathered around him. Knights, priests, and pilgrims prayed for his recovery. Yet he accepted his fate with serenity. He spoke little of his suffering, reminding his companions that a knight serves God in life and in death. On July Shubat, Ibite, Godfrey of Bouillon passed away. The defender of the Holy Sepulchre had laid down his sword forever. His death struck Jerusalem like a storm. Knights wept openly. Priests chanted solemn masses, and pilgrims crowded the streets in mourning. The city had lost not merely a ruler, but a symbol of faith and justice. The death of Godfrey shook the Crusader kingdom to its core. For years, he had been the unifying figure, the knight who led them through fire, hunger, and blood to Jerusalem. Now that anchor was gone. His body was laid in solemn procession to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Knights marched in silence, banners lowered. Priests swung censers of incense, filling the air with the fragrance of prayer. Pilgrims lined the streets, some weeping openly, others falling to their knees as the procession passed. Within the sepulchre, his body was laid to rest beside the very place Christ was buried. It was a fitting end for the man who refused a crown and chose instead the title of defender. Chroniclers wrote of miracles and visions surrounding his death. Some claimed to see light shining over the sepulchre. Others swore angels were present. Whether truth or devotion, his burial cemented his legacy. Jerusalem wept, not for a king, but for a shepherd. And from that day, Godfrey was remembered as more than a ruler. He became legend. With Godfrey gone, Jerusalem faced uncertainty. The Crusaders needed a leader strong enough to defend the fragile kingdom. Attention turned to his younger brother, Baldwin of Boulogne. Unlike Godfrey, Baldwin was ambitious and pragmatic. Where his brother refused a crown, Baldwin accepted it eagerly. In Ibite, he was crowned King of Jerusalem at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. The city that had known Godfrey's humility now saw its first monarch. The shift was dramatic. Baldwin's rule emphasized authority, power, and consolidation. He sought to strengthen the kingdom with firm hand, sometimes clashing with nobles and churchmen. While Godfrey ruled as a shepherd, Baldwin ruled as a king. Some mourned the loss of Godfrey's gentleness, yet others welcomed Baldwin's assertiveness, believing it necessary to secure the kingdom's survival. The era of humility had passed, replaced by the era of kingship. Still, Baldwin never escaped his brother's shadow. Godfrey was remembered as the ideal knight, the saintly defender. Baldwin ruled Jerusalem, but Godfrey continued to inspire it. After Godfrey's death, his story spread across Europe like wildfire. Chroniclers wrote of him as the perfect knight, brave, humble, and pious. Songs and epics turned him into a hero larger than life. Some tales claimed angels aided him at Jerusalem, others that he was chosen by God himself. Minstrels carried his story from castle to castle. Peasants whispered his name with reverence. In monasteries, monks recorded his deeds with glowing words. Over time, legend and truth blurred. Was he the unselfish defender of Christendom, or the conqueror of Jerusalem's people? Each telling shaped him differently. Yet all agreed on one thing: Godfrey embodied the crusading ideal. He was the knight who refused a crown, who placed faith above ambition. His humility became a symbol inspiring future generations of warriors and pilgrims alike. In Europe, statues were raised, poems sung, and chronicles filled with his memory. In the Holy Land, pilgrims prayed at his tomb. Godfrey was gone, but his legend had only begun. Long after his death, Godfrey of Bouillon lived on through stories. In the courts of Europe, troubadours and minstrels sang ballads of the Crusade. His deeds were magnified. His image transformed into that of a knight touched by heaven. Chansons de geste, epic poems, made him a hero of legend. In these tales, he was no longer only a mortal knight, but a chosen warrior of God, battling giants, demons, and mythical beasts. Alongside fellow Crusaders, though far from truth, these stories carried a deeper meaning. Godfrey became a symbol of Christian knighthood, the ideal to which all should. Nobles and peasants alike thrilled to hear his name. Children learned of his courage in bedtime tales. Monks recorded him in chronicles, shaping him as both saint and soldier. His refusal of the crown was remembered not as mere humility, but as divine wisdom. Through song and story, Godfrey's image spread wider than the reach of his sword. The man who ruled Jerusalem briefly had become an immortal figure in the imagination of Christendom. As centuries passed, voices began to question the legacy of Godfrey and the Crusaders. To Christians, he was the holy defender of the Sepulchre, a model of knightly virtue. But to Muslims and Jews, his conquest brought slaughter and sorrow. Chroniclers of the Islamic world remembered the fall of Jerusalem as a day of tragedy when the holy city was drenched in blood. Jewish accounts told of suffering and exile. Even among Christians, some debated whether the violence was justified or whether zeal had blinded them. Godfrey's refusal of the crown remained admired, but his leadership was seen in two lights, either as the humble servant of Christ or as the conqueror who presided over massacre. History became divided. Was he saint or sinner, guardian or invader? The answer often depended on the voice telling the story. Yet, this tension ensured that Godfrey's name never faded. He became not just a man of history, but a symbol through which people argued about faith, power, and justice. Over time, Godfrey became the embodiment of the Crusader ideal to knights of later generations. His story was the template, a noble lord who gave up wealth, marched across continents, fought for faith, and refused earthly glory. Chivalric orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers looked to him as inspiration. They saw in him the perfect balance of sword and cross, war and devotion. His image adorned banners. His memory evoked in ceremonies of knighthood. In literature, he was cast as the model Christian knight, courageous, humble, faithful, even when truth blurred into legend. The essence of his character remained, a man who sought not a crown of gold, but a crown of thorns. This symbolic power outlasted the Crusades themselves. Long after Jerusalem was lost, knights across Europe still swore by his name. Godfrey was no longer simply a man. He was an ideal, a standard against which all warriors of Christendom were measured. Thus, Godfrey's image shifted with the centuries, molded by each culture and age. From medieval epics to modern monuments, his story was never static. Each generation saw in him what it wished: hero, villain, saint, or warning. What remained constant was his power to provoke memory. The Knight of Jerusalem never faded into obscurity. Godfrey of Bouillon lived less than 50 years and ruled Jerusalem for barely one. Yet his legacy has endured nearly 1,000 years. Why? Because his story is more than history. It is myth, symbol, and lesson. To some, he represents faith unshaken, a man who gave all for his God. To others, he embodies the contradictions of the Crusades, Holiness and violence, devotion and destruction. His refusal of the crown remains one of the most powerful gestures. In medieval history, a reminder that true greatness lies not in power, but in humility. In every age, Godfrey's story has been retold, sometimes glorified, sometimes condemned, but always remembered. He challenges us to ask, what does it mean to fight for faith? What is the cost of glory? Where does justice end? And whether saint or conqueror, hero or warning, Godfrey of Bouillon stands as a figure larger than life. His sword no longer gleams, his voice is silent, but his story continues to echo. And so, across centuries, he remains what he chose to be. Not a king of gold, but the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, eternal, remembered and debated forever. And so, our journey through the life of Godfrey of Bouillon draws to a close. We have walked beside him from the castles of his youth to the blazing deserts of Anatolia, from the walls of Antioch to the gates of Jerusalem. We have seen him fight, suffer, endure, and finally lay down his life. Not as a king crowned with gold, but as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, crowned with faith and humility. Godfrey's story is more than history. It is a mirror of the human soul. Our longing for glory, our hunger for meaning, our struggle between faith and power. To some, he is a hero, to others, a conqueror, but to all, he is unforgettable. As you reflect on his journey, ask yourself, what does true leadership mean? Is it the grasp for power, or the courage to lay it aside? Is it conquest of cities, or guardianship of souls? May the story of Godfrey of Bouillon remind us that greatness is not measured by crowns or thrones, but by the values we defend, the faith we carry, and the humility we keep. Thank you for watching. Until our next journey, farewell